Let's talk about preterism, and we'll start with what it gets right. 70 AD mattered. Yahusha warned his generation that Jerusalem was going to be judged and the temple was going to fall. And Rome came, Jerusalem fell, and the temple was destroyed. That was a real covenant judgment. So I'm not going to pretend that Matthew 24 has nothing to do with the first century when it clearly does. And if you believe that 70 AD fulfilled a lot of the prophecy, but the resurrection and the return are still ahead, then this video isn't aimed at you. The problem starts when someone says everything was completed in 70 AD. The resurrection happened, the return happened, the final judgment happened, the new creation arrived, and nothing remains. And that's where full preterism breaks, because it takes the verdict and calls it the end of the story. The covenant sequence is simple. It runs throughout the entirety of Scripture. You have breach, warning, escalation, verdict, and then restoration. 70 AD fits the verdict. But now, where's the restoration? Show me the restoration. That's the test for preterists. And before we go any further, let's go ahead and jump into Matthew 24 and deal with it, because this is the strongest argument preterism has. Yahusha says, "This generation shall not pass away until all these things take place." I accept that. The Greek word used there is genia, which means generation, not aeon, which means age. In fact, Matthew distinguishes between the two. He uses aeon in the same chapter when the disciples ask about the consummation of the age. So I'm not going to change this generation into this age just to try to protect my theology. That generation really was going to see judgment, but here's what full preterism skips. The disciples actually asked two different things. When will these things happen, referring back to the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of Yahusha's coming and the consummation of the age? Now, those ideas may be connected in their minds, but Matthew doesn't use the same language for them. And even more importantly, Matthew had already told us what the consummation of the age looks like back in Matthew 13. Yahusha says the harvest is the consummation of the age. That's a key point there, the harvest. So keep that word in mind, because Paul is going to use the same architecture later. So yes, Matthew 24 gives you a first century judgment horizon. What it doesn't give you is proof that every resurrection text, every restoration text from Acts 1, Daniel 12, 1 Corinthians 15, and Revelation 21 were exhausted by that same event. Preterists still have to prove that. Now, let's go back to the covenant sequence. Again, it's breach, warning, escalation, verdict, then restoration. So now one may ask, what does restoration look like? Well, if you understand what a jubilee is, that gives us a solid picture. You have release, return, and inheritance restored. Now compare that with 70 AD. The land was lost, the people were scattered, the temple was destroyed, inheritance was devastated. That's not restoration. That's judgment. You can't call scattering return. You can't call dispossession restored inheritance, and you can't call temple destruction a jubilee. Again, 70 AD fits the verdict. It doesn't fit the restoration. The appointed times show the same thing. The sequence doesn't end with judgment. You have Sukkot, which comes last, which is dwelling, presence, Yahuwah with his people. And Revelation ends in exactly that direction. Yahuwah dwelling with humanity, the curse removed, the tree of life restored, death gone. So if everything was completed in 70 AD, where'd that happen? The sanctuary wasn't expanded until Yahuwah's presence filled everything. It was destroyed. So again, one is judgment, the other is restoration. Those aren't the same outcome. Now, we get to the resurrection, and this is where full preterism has its biggest problem. Remember what Yahusha called the consummation of the age in Matthew 13? The harvest. Now, listen to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Yahusha raises first. Paul calls him the firstfruits. Then those who belong to him are raised afterward. There's your harvest. And that matters because firstfruits tells you what kind of harvest is coming. Yahusha didn't have an invisible covenantal resurrection. His body came out of a grave. Paul points to that event and calls it the first fruit or first fruits of what follows. So here's a question full preterism has to answer. How did the harvest become a different kind of thing from its own first fruits? Where does Paul tell you that? If Yahusha's resurrection was bodily and his resurrection defines the first fruits, why does the harvest suddenly become an invisible covenantal event in 70 AD? See, the burden is on full preterism to prove that change from the text. And 70 AD can't be the reason. 2 Timothy 2 makes it even harder. Hymenaeus and Philetus were teaching that the resurrection had already happened. Paul says they had wandered from the truth. Now, the full preterist answer is obvious here. They say they were just too early. The resurrection happened later in 70 AD. Okay, fine. But that answer proves something important. That means the claim that the resurrection had already happened could be tested, right? If that could be false, then the resurrection had to have recognizable content. It wasn't enough to simply say it happened spiritually, that you just didn't see it. But now that creates a contradiction. And then Paul gives another marker in 1 Corinthians 15. The last enemy destroyed is death. Last time I checked, death is still here. So if you tell me Paul means some other kind of death, then show me from the text why. Where? And don't go try to change the meaning of the outcome simply because your timeline requires it. Acts 1 creates the same problem with Yahusha's return. The disciples physically watch him ascend. Then they're told that this same Yahusha will come in the same manner as they saw him go. Now, I'll be fair. The prophets use coming language for judgment. I agree. That can explain judgment coming language in places like Matthew 24. But Acts 1 says more. Again, it says this same Yahusha, the same Messiah, in the manner they saw him go. A Roman army attacking Jerusalem doesn't fulfill that. So if you want Acts 1 to describe an invisible judgment event in 70 AD, show me where Acts tells you to read it that way. And if your version of preterism says the Messiah somehow came as the priesthood, then you have another problem. The Torah doesn't make the priesthood and the Messiah interchangeable. The Aaronic priesthood has its own lineage and function. The Davidic ruler has another. Now, Yahusha can unite priestly and royal functions in himself, but that doesn't mean the priesthood itself becomes the Messiah. And if you point to the Jewish-Roman war lasting roughly 3.5 years, then yeah, I give you that. That's an interesting correspondence, but matching a number isn't the same thing as fulfilling a prophecy. The stated outcome still has to happen. Now, look at the method full preterism uses. This generation's literal. At hand is literal. Shortly is literal. Okay, got it. But when the outcomes don't appear in 70 AD, suddenly the reading changes. Resurrection becomes spiritual. Death becomes covenantal. New creation becomes symbolic. The return becomes symbolic. The final dwelling becomes symbolic. And again, I'm going to be fair here. Symbolism itself isn't the problem. The prophets use symbolism constantly. But the question is what controls the symbolism? The text or the need to make 70 AD complete everything? Because if every outcome that didn't happen has to be turned into a metaphor, then 70 AD is no longer being tested by Scripture. Scripture is being reshaped around 70 AD. So let's sum up the whole argument. I'll give you Matthew 24. I'll give you this generation. I'll give you that 70 AD was a real prophetic judgment. But that only gets you to the verdict. Again, for the third time, the covenant sequence is breach, warning, escalation, verdict, and then restoration. Show me the restoration. Show me the harvest that matches first fruits. Show me death destroyed. Show me Sukkot dwelling. Show me the curse removed. Show me Acts 1 fulfilled in the manner of Yahusha's departure. Show me where Scripture turns the priesthood itself into the Messiah. And show me the textual rule that allows every missing outcome to become a metaphor while every timing statement remains literal. Because if the answer is always it happens spiritually, then the system can never lose. Anything that happened in 70 AD becomes fulfillment. Anything that didn't happen becomes symbolism. And that's not the text testing the theory, that's the theory protecting itself from the text. Again, 70 AD mattered. It fulfilled judgment. It vindicated Yahusha's warning. It belonged to that generation. But it was the verdict. It wasn't the restoration. Judgment isn't restoration. The first fruits defines the harvest. Death continuing isn't death destroyed. And the verdict isn't the end of the story.